Confucius doesn't mention the word happiness a lot, or should I say, he doesn't mention the Chinese words for happiness, and yet he's often talking about happiness. I once asked a very respected professor of Chinese philosophy, who was a Confucian through and through, if Confucianism was a religion or a philosophy. And without hesitating, he said, "It was you Westerners who invented those terms, religion and philosophy, not us." The bottom line is that Confucianism is not a philosophy or a religion. It's a way of life. And you can say that about Asian philosophy in general, including Buddhism. East Asian philosophy is not really philosophy in the Greek sense of the word, i.e., philo and sophia, the love of wisdom. For example, in the case of Socrates, philosophy was mainly about self-discovery, and especially about uncovering your own thought processes and misconceptions. And of course, that is what the Socratic method is all about. Confucius was more focused on self-cultivation, the charismatic power of personal example. The word cultivation comes from agriculture, and that's not accidental. According to Confucius, you have the sprouts of virtue in you, and you need to feed those fragile little sprouts. That's very close to what we now call social emotional learning in the West. A famous Chinese scholar once said that Confucius has two goals: self-cultivation and social harmony. And of course, both of those goals are about well-being in the sense of long-term happiness. I should mention that in the case of Socrates, self-discovery is related to happiness too, but let's talk about that later. As mentioned a little earlier, Confucius didn't actually mention the concept of happiness a lot, but he talks about it all the time. And what he says about it is very thought-provoking and a little mysterious. Why is that? Confucius, like many Chinese thinkers, doesn't want to give us the answers on a plate. He wants us to brainstorm, to struggle for the answers. He wants us to chase after the butterfly of truth and keep it alive. He doesn't want to kill that butterfly. He doesn't want to kill the truth by pinning it down in words. As Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, once said, "The great storekeeper doesn't keep his treasures in the front window of the store. You have to make your way to the back of the store." Friendship, the Tao, and happiness. Perhaps it's no coincidence that the opening two passages of the Analects, the most celebrated record of Confucius' sayings, both talk about happiness. Let's read through each of these passages for a moment. The master said, "Isn't it a pleasure to study and put into practice what you've learned? Isn't it also a joy when friends visit from afar?" During my student days at the Confucian University in Seoul, Korea, I once received a call from a mysterious American visitor, a professor of religion from Haverford College, Paul Desjardins. He wanted to visit the Confucian temples of Seoul, but he only had one question to ask the temple administrators. What was the relationship between these two famous passages? Between studying and practicing and meeting a friend from afar? I was very puzzled. Why had this elderly professor traveled to the opposite side of the globe to ask such a trivial question? I felt too embarrassed to translate for him. Desjardins' theory was that the friend from afar that Confucius is talking about is no ordinary friend. She's a special friend, a fellow traveler on the way to self-realization, the Tao, who tries to put into practice what she's learned. That's what makes the meeting between you such a joyful experience. That's the link between the two verses. The link is happiness. I told the professor that the Korean Confucians had probably not even thought about his question. So instead of asking me to visit Korean temples with him, he spent many hours asking me about my experiences studying Confucianism in Korea. After a few days, we became the best of friends. We were 30 years apart. I was 29, he was around 60. But the day he left, he said to me, "You are my friend from afar, my fellow traveler on the Tao." I'm so grateful that I met him. How strange that this American professor of religion, who traveled 6,000 miles and who had not set a foot in a Confucian temple, taught me about the Confucian secret to happiness. Happiness and humanity. The master said, people who lack humanity, 人, cannot handle long periods of difficulty or experience long-term happiness. People of humanity take comfort in humanity. People of learning profit from humanity. The Chinese word 人 is a tricky word to translate. It's one of those wonderful pictographs with two symbols, a symbol of a human next to the number 2. The symbol for a human, which consists of 2 legs, is a little abbreviated, with one on top of the other. That's because the Chinese often have to squeeze lots of meaning into a small space. Essentially, it means 2 people. The best interpretation of 人 or humanity that I have heard is very close to the Native American expression to walk a mile in another man's moccasins. Confucius' idea of humanity is about trying to place yourself in someone else's shoes and acting upon that feeling, with the emphasis on action. So it's more than sympathy. It was practical sympathy based on action that led to long-term happiness. The deep bonds that often resulted from the practice of kindness were a source of great comfort and stability. So what about the final line of the quote? When Confucius talks about the word profit, it's not a good sign. And in this line, he's talking about knowledge, not wisdom. He hated sophisticated people in the original sense of the word, the students of the sophists. They are trained to be speakers, not doers. They love to talk about virtue, but that's the only thing they do, they talk. And they often make money out of it in the process. Confucius once shocked his followers by saying, "I hate the proper villager. He is the thief of virtue. He walks by my door, but does not enter in. He carries the semblance of virtue." In other words, the proper villager does the right thing. He kisses babies and contributes to public causes. But he does the right thing for the wrong reasons. Perhaps for Confucius, it's worse than not doing anything. The proper villager practices humanity for status and profit. He goes through the motions without the emotions. He profits from humanity, and in the end, he devalues it. Happiness and the meaningful life. If I had to pick one quote from the history of Chinese philosophy that I would like to post on my study door, this would probably be it. The master said, "Coarse rice to eat, water for drink, and my arm as a pillow." You can find happiness in that too. Wealth and honor obtained unrighteously are like floating clouds to me. This is who Confucius was. These are the words of a man who spent 12 years on the road, a very dangerous road, pleading with the ruthless and apathetic leaders of China to base their government on humanity and propriety. But they wouldn't listen. And so Confucius often spent the night on the road with nothing but rice to eat and his elbow for a pillow. Yet in the middle of rejection and poverty, he experienced happiness. This is exactly what the psychologist Martin Seligman refers to as the meaningful life, the third stage of happiness. We'll talk about that a little later. As we have mentioned, Like Socrates, Confucius was a troublemaker. But unlike Socrates, he was more of a leadership trainer than a philosopher, training a ragtag group of radicals in what seemed to be a quixotic effort to rescue China from destruction. And China was in deep trouble. The central states were breaking up, and it was a very bad breakup, resulting in social and political chaos. Confucius insisted that in order to change the world, you had to change yourself first. Transformative leadership based on personal example was the glue that would keep the central states from complete disintegration and restore peace to the empire. Confucius was the opposite of Machiavelli. He felt that no matter how technically brilliant a leader could be, no matter how sophisticated the machinery of government, if rulers couldn't walk the walk as well as talk the talk, they would fail. The rulers of China ignored him, or they poked fun at him. But he didn't give up. He was what I would call a VIP, not that kind of VIP. He had vision, intention, and passion. He had a clear vision, selfless intentions, and a strong, stubborn passion. 300 years later, his terse sayings, a little like philosophical haiku, reached out of the page and grabbed Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty. That's how a humble teacher, who often used his arm as a pillow, and who found happiness in the midst of rejection, transformed the Han Dynasty, and later the whole of East Asia. Happiness and education. The master said, knowing it is not as good as liking it. Liking it is not as good as rejoicing in it. The bottom line is that genuine learning has 3 stages. Stage 1 is about intellectually knowing something. It doesn't move you. You memorize it for a day or two, take the final, get your certificate or credit, and then you forget about it. The second stage of learning is about taking an interest in what you learn. You begin to like it, and it begins to become a part of you. The third stage, what Confucius calls rejoicing in it, is the eureka stage. You remember that Greek guy Archimedes who was asked by the king if his crown was made of pure gold or not? Archimedes didn't know how to figure that out until one day, while he was taking a bath, he suddenly realized how he could find out, by seeing how much water the crown displaced. Now, I don't know if he actually had the crown in the bath with him at the time, but that moment of realization was a moment of joy. In fact, Archimedes was so happy that he jumped out of the tub and ran naked through the streets of Syracuse, shouting, "Eureka! I have found it!" While he was reflecting in the tub, he had suddenly found the answer. This kind of knowledge, the kind that moves you, is what Wang Yangming, a famous follower of Confucius, called genuine knowledge. It can literally move you out of a bathtub, or it can move you simply in an emotional way. But you rejoice in the discovery, and somehow it changes you. And by changing you in a small way or a big way, it can change the world. It rubs off. You want to tell people about it. According to Wang, whom we talk about later, 2 kinds of knowledge exist: empty knowledge, or what he called common knowledge, and genuine knowledge. Let's take one more look at Confucius' saying. If you only know something intellectually, that's empty knowledge. If you went to high school, I think you know what empty knowledge is. Liking something is the second stage. The third kind of knowledge, the aha knowledge, the one that makes you happy, is genuine knowledge. It changes you, and through you, it changes the world. Isn't it mysterious how your favorite book might have filled you with genuine knowledge, and yet one of your instructors in the same room, or perhaps on the same Zoom call, sent you to sleep with empty knowledge? Right now, through this video, I'm trying to convey knowledge to you. You may be dozing off, or you may actually be listening to this. But how do you get to the third stage? How do you experience happiness in the process of learning? Confucius answers that question in the very opening passage of his teachings, which we read at the beginning of this video. Isn't it a joy to study and put it into practice? Confucius and the Science of Happiness. So now let's talk about the parallels between the insights of Confucius and recent discoveries in the science of well-being. The impact of close friendship on happiness is clearly reflected by scientific studies around the world. One of the most memorable is the Harvard study led by Robert Waldinger that tracked the well-being of 268 sophomores for more than 80 years. One of the key discoveries was the impact of close relationships on well-being, both psychological and physical well-being, especially in relationships with family and friends. But what about the quality of friendship? Depending on the way you read it, Confucius' comments that we read earlier about friendship and the Tao imply that friendship is reinforced by shared and meaningful goals. Scientifically speaking, meaning and well-being are now becoming a big topic of interest, but we don't yet have enough data. Having said that, we do have evidence showing that self-disclosure, in other words, sharing our most deeply felt opinions and emotions, is key to our happiness. As for the linkage between happiness and humanity, and especially acts of kindness, we have a growing body of scientific evidence. One of the most well-known studies was reported under the memorable title, "Yes, Money Can Make You Happy If You Give It Away." The authors of the study, Dunn and Norton, discovered this by tracking the spending behavior and mood of 600 workers who received bonuses, and discovered that there was indeed a link between their generosity and their well-being. On top of that, they found out that in a specific experiment, people who were given $5 to spend on others were happier than those that spent $20 on shopping for themselves. Now, those studies were mainly about giving away money, but Confucius' idea of humanity requires a little more than random acts of kindness and generosity. It involves a bigger psychological component. That is, a conscious effort to put oneself in a person's shoes and act accordingly. Let's talk about the link between long-term happiness and what we call the meaningful life. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who pioneered the study of meaning and its power to increase human resilience during the Holocaust, insisted that people should not chase after success and happiness. And he explains the reason for this in a famous quote. "Don't aim at success. The more you aim at it and make it a target, the more you are going to miss it. For success, like happiness, cannot be pursued. It must ensue, and it only does so as the unintended side effect of one's personal dedication to a greater cause." This is why, in the middle of rejection and poverty, Confucius experienced a deep sense of peace and happiness. He had a mission. No matter how many leaders ignored him, and how many nights he had to stay up teaching clueless students about the power of Run, humanity, he wouldn't give up. Martin Seligman, the pioneer of positive psychology, talks about 3 dimensions of happiness: the pleasurable life, the engaged life, or what we call the good life, and finally, the meaningful life. Seligman argues that to live a meaningful life, which results in a deeper, more long-term sort of happiness, one needs to do 2 things. The first thing is to discover one's unique set of core strengths, or what he calls signature strengths. And the second thing is to use those strengths in the service of a greater purpose. Solomon's not talking about complete self-sacrifice. Dedication to a greater purpose can be personally very fulfilling, especially if you enjoy doing what you excel at. And that's exactly what Confucius was doing. He had a couple of very important strengths. He was a born educator who loved learning, and he was as stubborn as a goat. He used both of those strengths to cultivate his own humanity, transform his students, and in the process, influence Chinese ideas of well-being and leadership for 2,000 years.